I'm recording this episode using my laptop mic, and I'll be upgrading in future episodes, but I didn't want to wait to start unpacking some really big claims. Whether you're excited, skeptical, or just curious about Colossal's direwolf announcement, I hope this episode gives you the language and the tools to think through it with clarity. If the words direwolf and scientific breakthrough make you picture Game of Thrones with a lab coat, that's exactly the point. But today, we're stripping the fur off the fantasy and talking about why this sounds more branding than research. Colossal Biosciences has announced that they've created a direwolf, and while plenty of scientists have already pointed out why that claim doesn't hold up, this episode isn't starting with taxonomy. We're starting with something more fundamental: the feeling. That, wait a minute, is this even okay? Moment. That quiet discomfort you couldn't quite explain. This episode is here to unpack what that feeling is, where it comes from, and why it matters ethically, scientifically, and socially. Welcome to Ethics Unfiltered. I'm Chippy, and today in our Spectacle Science series, we're talking about the difference between editing a genome and reviving a species, the difference between conservation and performance, and why that tension matters more than it may appear. You don't need a PhD in evolutionary biology to feel uneasy about this project. And honestly, that's part of the issue. We've created this cultural script where if you're not in the lab, you don't get to ask questions, where skepticism gets mistaken for ignorance. But in science, good science, questions are a sign of engagement, not defiance. So let's talk about that feeling. The one that might have started with curiosity and then quickly turned into that itch behind your eyeball. You might have wondered, how do they even know what a dire wolf was like? Isn't that kind of dangerous? Can we just do that now? Is this even legal? Why does this feel more like Jurassic Park than peer review? That's not you being anti-science, that's you picking up on something real. A disconnect between the claims being made and the questions being avoided. Tech stories, especially ones wrapped in climate urgency or extinction legacy, tend to lean on all language. It's evocative. It sounds urgent. But if it feels more like a trailer than a research protocol, that's not on you. That's by design. This isn't about tearing down big ideas. It's about asking, what are we being promised? What are we actually being shown? And what's really being done? In a moment, we'll walk through Colossal's public statement and whether it holds up scientifically or ethically. But first, we need to talk about what should be in place when science touches the public. Let's say that weird feeling is still with you. That's not you being reactionary. That's you asking, where are the brakes? Ethical review isn't just for drugs or human subjects. It's a core part of research across disciplines, especially when you're dealing with ecosystems, sentient beings, and life forms that didn't consent to be redesigned. Here's something most people don't know. Lay people, non-scientists, are required to sit on ethics review boards. That discomfort you felt, that's not just valid, it's structurally necessary. Ethics boards aren't ivory towers. They're built to include educators, lawyers, nurses, even your local accountant. Because ethics isn't just about technical safety, it's about social trust. It asks, what does this research mean for the world beyond the lab? When a project skips that step or buries it under internal conversations, what it's really saying is, we don't want to be questioned by people outside the hype cycle, which is not how ethical science works. And it's not just biomedical oversight that matters. There are ecological regulatory boards too, tasked with evaluating invasive species risk, wildlife safety, habitat disruption, and conservation policy. those agencies should be looped in before you genetically modify and potentially release a predator, even one that's technically a wolf. We'll talk more about those systems in a future episode. But for now, know this: those checks exist for a reason. Colossal has emphasized its internal ethical deliberations, and sure, some of those people may be thoughtful. But a private conversation is not a public safeguard, and peer review can't happen inside your own press release. So if you've ever thought, who am I to question this? I'm not a scientist. Let me be clear. You are exactly the kind of person these systems are meant to include. Science doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in society, and society means you. If all of this feels cinematic, it's probably because Colossal isn't just backed by Silicon Valley venture capital. One of its most high-profile investors is George R. Martin, the creator of Game of Thrones, a man whose fictional direwolves helped reintroduce them into pop culture. And let me give him his due. His storytelling did raise awareness of direwolves, especially among a generation that might have never heard of them otherwise. He made them mythic. But investing in a biotech startup claiming to revive those creatures, that blurs a line that matters. Because when a fantasy author with an emotional stake in the animal is funding a project like this, we have to ask, are we making decisions for the planet or for the narrative? That's the real danger here. Not that science is becoming imaginative, but that the public is being asked to believe a story that hasn't gone through science. It might be poetic, but it's not a protocol. After people started questioning the legitimacy of the project, Colossal released a statement to clarify their position. And to their credit, they didn't hide behind PR layers. They said this publicly. We understand that some scientists are not comfortable calling these direwolves because they feel like the wolves are not sufficiently genetically similar to an extinct individual to merit that name. That's okay with us. We can disagree about what makes a direwolf qualify as a direwolf or what makes a mammoth qualify as a mammoth. Colossal has 500 times more data than anyone has ever had on a direwolf. We have had a small army of people doing comparative genomics to wolves and other canids for the last 18 months with this proprietary dataset. We know what makes a direwolf, including that it is not closer to a jackal. We will be submitting that data next week for peer review. Colossal has always said that we are doing functional de-extinction, where we are looking to de-extinct the core genes that make a species as it relates to their phenotypes or physical attributes. The scientific community does not agree on how to classify species because it is a man-made construct that does not apply to nature, and that is why there are so many variants of it. Under several of the variants, the direwolf would be classified as a direwolf. We are calling it a direwolf because it is a direwolf. If you do not want to call it a direwolf, you can always call it Colossal's direwolf. So far, we've talked about how your discomfort with this project isn't irrational, it's ethical intuition. We've talked about how scientific oversight isn't gatekeeping, it's what makes research trustworthy. And now, we're going to look at the core of this project's public messaging. Let's take it seriously and walk through what it actually says. Because once you examine it on its own terms, you start to see the inconsistencies, not just in the science, but in the framing. Colossal says, we can disagree about what makes a direwolf a direwolf. We can't really disagree on that, because the science is already clear, and it's their own Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Beth Shapiro, who helped make it so. Shapiro co-authored the landmark Nature paper that reclassified direwolves into their own genus, Aenocyandirus. That study showed direwolves weren't just big gray wolves. They diverged from the Canis lineage over 5 million years ago, didn't interbreed with gray wolves, and left behind no modern descendants. So this isn't just a wolf cousin we lost track of. It's a parallel evolutionary branch, one we only know through fossils, not behavior. We don't have access to its full genome, its social structure, or its ecological role. And we don't truly know what it looked like beyond what its bones suggest. Unlike some dinosaurs whose feathers or pigments fossilized under exceptional conditions, we've never recovered a direwolf with preserved fur, skin, or soft tissue. There's no confirmed evidence of coloration, coat texture, or external traits beyond skeletal inference. So any claim to have recreated its appearance is at best educated speculation. Colossal has stated that they have used two ancient specimens to reconstruct a partial genome, but as of now, that sequence hasn't been released in a peer-reviewed publication or made publicly accessible. We only have their word and no independent verification of what that genome includes or how closely their edits reflect the original animal. We know what their bones look like. Everything else, we're guessing. We've identified the genes that drive the phenotype and de-extincted them. What this actually means is they've edited gray wolves to look like dire wolves based on guesses drawn from fossil structure and comparisons with other canids. But that's not de-extinction, that's phenotypic mimicry, which is a kind of aesthetic reconstruction. It's worth noting that we used to classify animals by their physical appearance or phenotype. But then, we learned about convergent evolution when unrelated species evolved similar traits like dolphins and ichthyosaurs. That's why taxonomy now relies more on genetic similarity, molecular clocks, and evolutionary lineage, not just looks. So, when Colossal says they've de-extincted the direwolf because they've reproduced its appearance, they're leaning on an outdated model of classification, one that science has largely moved beyond. And again, without knowing what a direwolf actually looks like on the outside or how it behaved, recreating it visually is more of a branding decision than a biological one. This isn't resurrection, it's resemblance marketed as science. Species is a man made construct. Yes, taxonomy is a human framework, but it's not arbitrary. It's built on testable biological principles like reproductive isolation, genetic distance, and shared ancestry. It's true that not all scientists agree on one fixed definition of species. But the solution to that isn't to make the term meaningless, it's to apply the best working model for the context, and in this case, genetic and evolutionary evidence places direwolves in a lineage distinct from gray wolves. Saying species is a construct and then redefining it to suit your PR campaign, that's not embracing complexity, that's obscuring it. Especially when the confusion helps support a commercial narrative. We have to ask, who benefits when the definitions get fuzzy? If you don't want to call it a direwolf, you can always call it Colossal's direwolf. And this is where the mask slips. Because this isn't about scientific classification anymore, it's about branding. When you start attaching a company's name to a synthetic animal, you're not talking about biodiversity, you're talking about intellectual property. Colossal hasn't brought back an extinct species. They've modified a gray wolf to wear a visual costume based on limited data using a partial genome no one outside the company has seen. That's not species revival, it's product development. It's not resurrection, it's a narrative with a genome. And even if we set the species identity debate aside, let's talk ecosystems. Because when you engineer a top predator, you're not just designing an animal, you're reintroducing a role. And that role has ripple effects. The direwolf's original niche doesn't exist anymore. They hunted megafauna, bison, horses, camels, giant ground sloths. But those prey animals went extinct at the end of the last ice age, which means this isn't about restoring balance, this is about inserting a fabricated predator into a system that may not have space for it. And this is where things get dicey. If the ecosystem can't support the animal, it dies. But if it does survive, by adapting to what's available, it risks destabilizing the entire food chain. That's why international regulations like the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety exist. It's designed to protect biodiversity by requiring countries to assess the ecological risk of genetically modified organisms, especially those being introduced into the wild. Now, the US didn't ratify the Cartagena Protocol, but that doesn't mean those standards don't matter. If these animals are meant to be released eventually, then they're not just building a brand, they're creating a biosafety issue. And they're doing it without international consensus, without a framework for accountability, and without clarity on how this affects the ecosystems that still exist. So, yes, let's talk about oversight. Let's talk about ethics. Because when you're editing life to fit an extinct aesthetic, the consequences aren't just genetic, they're ecological, they're political, and they're real. And if you love direwolves, I get it. They're magnificent. But we have to ask, do we need a facsimile of a long lost species, or do we need to protect the wolves that are still here? The ones whose ecosystems are collapsing, the ones who don't need CRISPR, they need habitat. This wasn't supposed to be the first episode. When I mapped out this show, I thought I'd begin with the basics: history, regulations, the building blocks of research ethics. But then Colossal dropped this direwolf announcement, and I realized people already feel the tension. They don't need a lecture, they need language. A way to say this doesn't sit right, and here's why. So that's what this is for. Not to gatekeep or to scold, but to give you the tools to name what you already see. And the power to question who benefits when science is sold as spectacle. This isn't fake science. There's real sequencing, real genetic engineering, real researchers. But when the brand outruns the benchwork, when the press release travels farther than the peer review, that's not science engagement, that's illusion. And the cost of that illusion? Misallocated resources, public trust spent on aesthetics, and conservation reframed as entertainment. Now, to be fair, maybe the Direwolf Project is Colossal's way of drawing attention. Maybe it's meant to pull people in, to get them excited, to generate funding and support for their other work, like the Red Wolf cloning effort they recently announced. And if that's the plan, if direwolves are the eye-catching front for a deeper conservation mission, then let's talk about that. Let's see the bridge between spectacle and substance. Let's see real public follow-through. Because meanwhile, real, currently existing wolves, gray wolves, red wolves, Mexican gray wolves, are still fighting extinction. And even with cloning projects in play, these animals need more than lab work. They need space to live, laws that protect them, people fighting for their survival in the wild, not just in a genome. So we need to ask, who gets the funding? Who gets the headlines? And who gets left behind when the hype machine kicks in? If this is meant to spark conversation, great. Let's have the conversation. Let's ask questions. Let's scrutinize claims. If this is about conservation, awesome. Then let's see the conservation strategy. Where are the habitats, the partners, the published plans? And if this is speculative science, that's fine. But you have to name it as such. Don't wrap uncertainty in certainty. Don't market fiction as fact. Because the public deserves more than a headline. We deserve clarity, accountability, and honesty about what's real and what's still imagined. This has been Spectacle Science, part of Ethics Unfiltered. And this episode wasn't just about Colossal's direwolf, It was about a larger pattern, where the line between innovation and illusion is getting harder to see. If you want to understand how ethical review is supposed to work, what's protected, who's included, and why it matters, I've got you. The Ethics of Innovation series is where we unpack the history, the regulations, and the why behind it all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for asking questions. And thank you for trusting your gut. Because in a world full of hype, discernment is resistance, and you already have it. I'm Chippy, this is Ethics Unfiltered, and I'll see you in the next episode of Spectacle Science, where we trade direwolves for mammoths and look at why climate savior narratives might be the most dangerous woolly coat of all.